They've given me a new microphone tonight so you can actually hear me because my mother, who's was half Irish and half French Canadian, used her hands a lot. So I guess I get some of that, so I can still use my hands, but I got a microphone now. I know some of you were not here last week, and so you missed the first 1,000 years. I'm not going to summarize it for you. You're on your own, but Jim can help you. Is the link on the website?
It's on YouTube, Epiphany Catholic Church on YouTube.
Epiphany Catholic,
Church.
and it's on the website too. So, okay. So if you want to watch that first part of history, let's begin as always in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good and gracious God, we live in interesting times even this week, and with some of the things that happened this week actually mirror some of the things that happened in the past history of our church, more than a few times. Guide us with your wisdom as we learn about, especially tonight, the Renaissance and then the Reformation, trying to get to Napoleon tonight. And next week we'll go from Napoleon to the present time. Help us to appreciate our history, its ups and its downs, its strengths and its weaknesses, and how we often repeat the same questions over and over and over again. Thank you in a special way today for those of us as priests of the diocese. Our oldest priest was Father Bob Osborne, whose funeral was this morning. And Bob was just turned 98, but one of the real giants and a mentor to me, and a good friend of Father Jim Flynn. I took Jim to the funeral today. Jim is 96, almost 97. He's now the senior priest. He said, "Do I get paid any more for that?" I said, "No, Jim." I said, "You'll get more respect from us, but anyway." So for all these things and for all the history that we stand, the shoulders upon who people we stand, in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So just a kind of quick review, last week I'm trying to cover 9 eras, not errors, eras of the church, and we covered 4 of those last week. For those of you who might remember, we talked about the first 100 years, the age of the apostles, and the birth of the church, and how, for the most part, the gospels are being formed, the communities are being formed, but there's very little doctrine, there's nothing written down, no catechisms, no things like that, no institutional churches, because the church, for the most part, is persecuted and underground, but they begin to develop various things that we now look upon as the various ministries of the church, and became more evangelical in the sense of reaching out in the community. Then in the second couple hundred years, up until Constantine, was the age of the underground church, often on persecutions, not consistent, but this is the age of martyrs, and we hear a lot about martyrs. You begin to see the role of bishop, the episcopoi, the oversight role of communities, and they tended to be picked by the people because they were the most articulate, and they could articulate and preach well. Those were the criterions they looked at for that. We did have the role of deacons, and we had the role of presbyters, priests. But again, ordination was nothing like we think about it today and all the accoutrements of that. But we begin to see these various roles being formed in the church. And gradually the church kind of grows, and then by Constantine in the third era, Constantine, as you know, became a Christian, although he didn't get baptized until just before his death, because he wanted to make sure that if baptism forgives all my sins, I might make a few more before then. So he waited till the last minute His mother, Helena, of course, was a Christian. And of course, it's with Constantine that makes the church come out from underground. And because he's a Christian, if you want to be good to the emperor, you ought to be a Christian too. And so lots of people became Christian, not always for the right reasons. But in that era, the church began to expand, and the church began to take on, as it established buildings, which we called basilicas, which we still use that term sometimes, the gathering places, not lots, but many churches, not as fancy as the Middle Ages. But we begin to see that expansion of the church. And then, of course, there come other things during this period of time where the barbarians begin to come out of what we would call present-day Russia and the Slavic nations and begin to come down. And that causes all kinds of problems because they destroy everything. So people didn't have safes, so they took all their records and buried them. And if you buried them and you got killed, nobody knows where you buried him. And it's only in the last couple of centuries that we've found some of the things from these ages. And that moved us into what we call the Dark Ages, because we lost all the records even of Greek and Roman culture for the most part. And from the 600s to 1100 roughly, were the Dark Ages, where people begin to say, well, God is condemning us. And all of a sudden, instead of having churches in the round, I think there's a church here in Louisville that's in the round, but I don't forget what it is, but something like that. Because Epiphany is modeled on a 4th century church. That's in Rome. So the early church, people gathered around the altar. Well, then when you start saying, well, we're not worthy, okay, the tabernacle and the altar should be at the end of the church because we got to look toward God. We'll put some screens up there because we're not worthy to be in the presence of God. And people stop going to communion and all that kind of stuff, but observing from a distance because God was out there. And that affected a lot of the church during this particular period of time. It was also a time when, after the Roman Empire began to collapse and the split between the Eastern Empire and the Southern, or Eastern and Western Empire, it was also a time during the rise of Islam around the 600, and that moved across most of Africa and wiped out most of the Christians in that particular time and moved up into the Middle East in what's present-day Turkey and wiped out a lot of churches there. After so many of those churches in Turkey, that's where we get the Nicene Creed with the 4 councils of the 3rd and 4th century. But we begin to form a different structure of society into a pyramid rather than a circle. And of course, of the pyramid, the king is on top, or the emperor had been on top, and then you have the people around him, and then different levels, and then you have nobody in the middle, and then there's the hoi polloi, the peasants on the bottom. And that became a feudal society, and the church adopted that kind of structure as a model, and to some extent we still suffer from that, I think, at times. So that's really kind of quick of the first 1,000 years. You're all caught up now, okay? Roughly around 1100, a little bit before that, 1072, 78, it's very interesting that the first German pope was elected as pope. His name was Hildebrand. We got a few Hildebrands in the state of Kentucky like that, go back to that time. And being a good German, thinking in very much structured time, he began to try to say, we've got to separate the church from the state. We get too tied up with the state, as happened over and over and over again. And how can we do that? We need to set up a law within the church. And so he established what we call canon law. If you want ask a lot of questions, ask Bob Stinger back here. He'll tell you all about canon law. But not tonight, for sure. but citing a law within the church and the structure, to look at the structure of the church, sacraments, all that kind of thing. And canon law was established, as all law systems are, as basically a pastoral help to people, not to be necessarily used legalistically or rigidly. But unfortunately, over the ages, sometimes canon law has taken precedence over theology. And we look at laws rather than the theology, although there's always theology underneath the basis of the law. Even in the structure of canon law today, the first canons of every section are kind of theological principles by which to look at legal canons after that. My favorite canon, Jim Provost told me this years ago at a thing. He said, every pastor in the new Code of Canon Law of 1983 needs to know one code and memorize it. It's a NESI clause. NESI means unless. And in English, it's mentioned 327 times in the code. Unless pastoral discretion rules otherwise. Use your common sense. He was the head of the Canon Law Society at that time, and I said, okay, write that one down. Something like that. Sometimes I've had to use that with some bishops, but we're not going to go into that tonight, because it kind of slipped over their heads sometimes. So, let me make sure I get the right pages here. Oh, you have handouts there. One of the handouts is a simple handout that's going to look at the outline. I know you've got the full one tonight, but the simple outline might be helpful. On the back of that, you're going to see something about the Reformation. We're not there yet. I'll explain that diagram to kind of say how we split apart and how we might get back together again. So that hopefully. So looking at this next couple of centuries up to Martin Luther, who, his 90, the theses was in 1517. That's why I've broken it right there. It began a time after Hildebrand of Renaissance. Some records began to be found when many of the barbarians had either been converted or died off or left. And so there began to be a cultural rebirth, especially in Europe. And we began to establish universities. We began to have theological departments, all kinds of things like that. Merchants began to travel to India and even to the Far East and bring back all kinds of things. And there was also, it becomes a period of affluence. And with affluence, great artwork is done and all that kind of stuff. So the Renaissance had a really great gift of getting us back our culture and expanding that culture and looking at it in many different ways. And there was growing affluence. But one of the challenges, obviously, with affluence is corruption. And sometimes money controls everything, and the root of all evil is money sometimes. And we see that happens both in the civil society as well as sometimes within the church. Also, as it becomes that feudal period beginning to use, the church begins in its structures to use that pyramid model. The Pope is in charge at top. Popes had been important as the Bishop of Rome in the first 1,000 years, but no one's writing to Rome all the time, what can we do this or can we do that and all that kind of stuff. But it's in this period of time that the papacy becomes more and more centralized and more important at that time. And you see the dioceses, of course, were formed long before this, but now they became much more structured as well. And the communication style, again, for those of you who weren't last time, I've used a book called from Yves Congar, who kind of looked at every era and said, what's the culture? What's some of the images of church and the community? what's the communication style, and then what's the pluses and minuses of each era of the church. That's where this comes from. And so you begin to hear the term magisterium. Some of you perhaps are familiar with that. It comes from the Latin word magister, which means teacher. Now, up until this time, the bishops were looked upon as the primary theologians. And you had people like Augustine, as I said, and many of the great giants of the first 1,000 years were that. But now as you begin to have universities and as people begin to study all these kind of things, you begin the rise of theologians like Thomas Aquinas, which we'll hear about in a little bit. And of course, that begins to cause tension. You know, the bishop was what everybody looked at for theology. Now somebody's saying, well, the theologian studied all of this. Maybe he knows more than the bishop knows. And so the tension between bishops and sometimes theologians raising questions that and control issues get into all of that by human nature. So you begin to see that tension in the church. As you know, we've had 21 councils in the church, Vatican II being the last. 11 councils were during this period of time, these 400 years. Every couple, 25 or 50 years, they had a council trying to say, let's get together and let's solve the problem. Let's come up with another doctrine or something like that. So it's interesting to see how the church operated very differently in this era than from the previous eras. Some of the strengths that we see out of this, and I'll get into some of the characters in a couple minutes, the positive reforms. Canon law was probably a good thing. Some people don't like canon law. I always found it kind of fascinating, but because we all need some law structure. Even though there's some people today don't like any laws because it limits our freedom. And, that's sometimes our freedom needs to be limited in some ways. So that was a positive, but it always has a downside. Education in the arts flourished during this time. That was good for a lot of different things. And the rise of many new religious orders. Again, religious orders, as I mentioned last week, they become the counterculture movement over and over again because they take a vow of poverty. So they're going to challenge affluence, and they're going to challenge some of the abuses that go on. They look at the gospel and trying to live gospel norms when people don't want to hear about the gospel. They just want to hear about what's God going to give me. So you see a lot of religious orders, obviously Franciscans and Dominicans we'll talk about. So the weaknesses of this era, that balance of affluence versus corruption, both in the state and in the church. Of course, out of this, church needs money. So they created, indulgences. If you give so much money, you'll get a few days off of purgatory, or if you build a church, you'll get a free card into heaven, or something like that, So the idea, it was a good fundraising tool at the time, but that can lead to all kinds of problems. In many different ways, and that's one of the questions that people like Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, said, wait a minute, this is not right. Titles, again, as we become more of this feudal and hierarchical church, titles like a cardinal, I should have said, the Pope right before Hildebrand created the College of Cardinals. As the electors of the next pope. And basically they were the pastors of many of the churches in Rome. And so they became cardinal. The word cardinal, it means hinge. And so you might have 10 people, you might have 20 people. They would elect the next pope. And that's where we got the College of Cardinals and the beginning of the whole thing of conclaves. But that gets to be a problem sometimes too. The Pope begins to he's the vicar of Christ. These kind of more hierarchical, more Roman terms begin to come into the church at this point in time. And as I said, that tension between canon law and theology and kind of the battle between legalism, saying, well, the law says this, you got to follow the law. If you break the law, you're committing a sin. Well, is there a pastoral process in that? Sometimes there are exceptions to that rule. That gets messy. Who decides, is this an exception or not? Some of the people that we could talk about during this time, and there are many characters. One of the great early giants in the 12th century was Anselm. Go to St. Meinrad's. There's always a lot of, in their study of philosophy, they study a lot of Anselm, which is good. One of the first Catholic philosophers trying to bring back some of the great Greek philosophers, obviously Plato and Aristotle, and some of those kinds of things. One of the first religious orders was Bernard of Clairvaux, established the Cistercians. We call them Trappists. The Trappists are part of the Cistercian order, and created an order that lived by themselves, but very much lived the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and became some great models of the religious life in the century. Later, as the Crusades start, Bernard will be one of the great preachers of the Crusades. We got to get the Holy Land back. And he had, great ideas about doing that, and probably had great ideas about how that would be successful in something good. And then he began to see some of the bad things that came out of the Crusades, where we had mercenaries who just killed Muslims for lunch and destroyed lots of things from Islam. And of course that continued to put divisions between Christians and Muslims. Later, toward the end of his life, he said, I should not have preached the Crusades. Innocent III was one of the great popes of this period of time. At the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century, spent a lot of time trying to clarify sacraments. At this point, we didn't have 7 sacraments as we know it. That didn't come till the Council of Trent, that we named 7 sacraments. Obviously, baptism and Eucharist were the 2 primary sacraments, but began to clarify what do we mean by sacraments. The word sacrament came from Augustine. Pope Leo would like that, praising Augustine. He first used the word sacramentum, sacred moment, as there are holy moments that God becomes present in our lives. And that can come in lots of different ways, not just through the sacraments, but a lot of experiences in our lives. He tried to reform some of the abuses that were going on, but he also tried to make the papacy. Rome was going downhill very rapidly at this point in time as a city. Eventually, it's going to get down to 25,000 people. That's part of the reason Michelangelo hated to go to Rome, because Florence is the right city to be a part of. But he tried to make the papacy not just the spiritual leader of the world, but in one sense, not necessarily the political leader, but the moral leader of the world. And his influence, of course, was a great pope, did a lot of great things. Again, the papacy becomes more important. To the people that are started religious orders that we all know, there are many others besides them, but Dominic started the order of preachers, basically primarily to be preachers, to do missions, what we would call missions, or go into parishes, not necessarily to be teachers, although many of them, like Thomas Aquinas, became teachers, but also to give spiritual direction and deepen our sense of theology, and Dominicans have done that well over the years. And then, of course, the crazy guy named Francis of Assisi, And you know his story fairly well, that he came from a very well-to-do family in Assisi and decided when he was like a teenager, I don't like all this wealth and all this corruption that seems to come with it. I want to get rid of it all. And eventually begins to say, we got to get back to the basics. And he began to gather a group of people around him, both men and women, to start the order of Franciscans. And of course, they lived very seriously poverty, very seriously chastity and obedience to one another, and became really kind of the hippies of this century. And most people thought he was an absolute kook. And most people thought, that guy is really out of it. And always beware when you have somebody that's raising challenges that you consider a kook. In the next century, that person's probably going to be canonized. And that's happened over and over and over again in many different ways. Clare, of course, established the Franciscan Sisters. If you ever get to Assisi, always go to Assisi. It's an incredible little city on the hill. You get to see what the Middle Ages were like because it's a walled city. And at one end is Francis's, and the other end is Clare's end. I like the Clare end much better. That's where the San Damiano cross is, and it's just so much simpler. You really get a sense of Franciscan theology on Clare's end because it's gotten so commercial at the other end with Francis of Assisi. But she was interesting too because she established her convent outside the walls of Assisi. And everybody said, oh, you're women, you need to be inside the walls because you never know who's going to come in. She said, nope, God will provide. And so she was very, very, very strong. And the relationship of Clare and Francis is a very interesting one. It's also during this time, in the latter part of the 13th century, that some of the great giants, Albert the Great was a theologian. He's kind of the father of what we call scholastic theology, which, again, like Thomas Aquinas, was also a great theologian, had a great ability to take things together like Aristotle and Plato and that philosophy and translate all of theology into one based on that. His Summa Theologica is an incredible volumes written in the 13th century. I always like, especially my confirmation name was Thomas Aquinas, so I love Thomas Aquinas. And he had some problems, especially his understanding of women was a little bit, but that was based on his idea of science in his day. But when he talked about the proofs of the existence of God, was a good example. He goes through several different proofs of the existence of God, with nature, etc., etc., etc. Then he comes to the end and says, none of these absolutely prove the existence of God. But you'd be hard-pressed to say the opposite, that God doesn't exist based on all of these things. And I thought that was just a brilliant stroke, for Aquinas. But so again, we've got some great giants during this period of time. One of the interesting other people of this time is Roger Bacon, who becomes a scientist and does all kinds of study of science, which much of present-day science goes back to Roger Bacon in terms of, he was a Catholic who tried to say, okay, what can we learn from science that we can bring to our faith and our theology? And that's always been a tension between science and theology sometimes, but they need to mesh sometimes in many different ways. One of the things that happens beginning toward the next century is Boniface VIII. He has a battle with Philip IV of France, and they have a battle back and forth, and that's going to lead to 70 years of captivity. The next pope gets captive and gets pulled out of Rome over to Avignon, which is in the southeastern part of France. And for 70 years, the seat of the papacy is in France, not in Italy. I mentioned that only as a side because if you've read about anything that's happening lately, and you never know what to believe, but supposedly when the present administration called the papal nuncio to the Pentagon back in January, said you need to get this pope needs to be get with us and say what support us over here. You remember Avignon, supposedly that was said. Some people deny it or whatnot or something like that, but that was kind of a sign. Well, that's what happened in the past, and as Pope Leo said the other day, I ain't afraid in lots of ways. But that was a whole period in which the church was pulled out of Rome because of some of that church-state relationships and control and all of that. One of the interesting characters toward the end of that was the person who got the Pope to come back to Rome was Catherine of Siena. Catherine of Siena was a laywoman who became a third order Dominican. And she did a lot of preaching, a woman, and was her writings were very important. And she got out of, she lived in Siena, but went over to Avignon and told the Pope, "You need to get back to Rome and do your job." So he did. So it's always interesting some of the characters that we see during this time. Another great Franciscan philosopher who's not a canonized saint is Duns Scotus. Again, scholasticism is based on a lot of Aristotelian philosophy. I won't go into all of that. Some of us who were old had to study all this kind of stuff way back in the ancient days, because for most of the first part of the 20th century up until Vatican II, most priests were taught only scholastic philosophy. I was one of those guys that got to St. Mary's in Baltimore in 1965. It was still the old seminary, and within 1 year it switched to Vatican II. And instead of scholasticism, we were taught 1 year. The next year they taught us every other philosophy. Threw the book at us. It's existentialism and all that kind of stuff. And it was like, although I did learn a lot through that process, but it was a jolt for all of us in terms of that. It's always interesting. Charlie Detmeyer's class ahead of me. I was with him today. His class ahead of me at St. Mary's in Baltimore. He's the last class that had to take their philosophy classes in Latin. My class didn't have to do that. He said, it was interesting how that's a whole other experience of how the things changed at that point in time. We also begin to see during this time the splits within the church. Gregory the Ninth was elected pope, and then some other people said, well, he's not pope, and we ended up having 3 popes at one time. And who's the right pope and who isn't the right pope? And that one of them was named John the 23rd, who was not a pope. So somebody you all heard about named John the 23rd, he took the name to make sure we do have a true John the 23rd, because he knew that history. So eventually, after he resigned, they brought it all back together under one pope. But they had to deal with one of the problems that was happening. Remember, 11 councils were going on during this time? They were always doing, who's in charge? Is it the council and they're running the church, or is it the Pope? Is it both and? either or. We still struggle with that sometimes, even in our day, but sometimes they thought the councils had too much control and power. Sometimes people think the Pope has had too much control and power. How do we do a balance? Synodality, of course, that goes back to the 4th century in terms of why Pope Francis brought that back. We need to listen to everybody in the church. And but some people still don't like that. We start listening, all kinds of weird ideas start happening. Maybe. And you begin to see some reformers during this time. It's obviously a lot of turmoil, a lot of abuses going on. The clergy are not well trained at this time in many different ways, and there's all kinds of things going wrong with the clergy, as well as that affluence that's going on. And reformers begin to raise a lot of questions. And one of the first reformers was a Slavic reformer, John Huss. And unfortunately, when you're a reformer, like the prophets of the Old Testament, if you say the wrong things, you get killed. And he was the first of the reformers to get killed, and which turned a lot of people off for that. So it seems like during the 1400s, with the arts exploding, and many of the popes were paying for the various artists, like obviously Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, who came out of Florence. Florence was the great city in Italy at that point in time, as it still is, an amazing city. You go to Florence and you think the whole city's a museum because there's artwork everywhere, and some incredible artwork. But the popes were all interested in building churches and statues and all kinds of things. Sounds like some people today want to do some of that stuff. But they were more interested sometimes in those kind of things and the politics of their families than religion. And of course, we did not have some great, strong popes. We had some, but we had some incredibly bad popes, like Alexander the Sixth that I mentioned there at the bottom. The Borgia was probably the most immoral and probably the worst pope we've ever had in lots of different ways for all kinds of different reasons. He had lots of children and all that kind of stuff, but and made some of them cardinals and things like that. So, it's like, what? But you do have the great giants like Michelangelo, who was just a sculptor, as he often said. That's what he loved, was being a sculptor. He lived to be in his 90s. So that, and an amazing, not only was he a sculptor, which that was his favorite thing. I'm not a painter. So he does paintings like the Sistine Chapel, little things like that, or the Last Judgment scene at the end of the Sistine Chapel. It's a pretty good piece of art, you would think. But later on, he was asked when they were building the second St. Peter's. The first St. Peter's was built by Constantine back in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And that fell apart, so that when they built the new St. Peter's, they had an architect doing all this kind of stuff, and they couldn't get the dome right, or the plans. And the original plan said, that ain't going to work. And so who did they call? Michelangelo. He designed the dome of St. Peter's. An architect, too? Where do you get these geniuses? Something like that. And Da Vinci, of course, a lot of the studies there is. And these are great, giant people. If you obviously go to Rome, you'll obviously the Pietà, which is to your right, and when you go into St. Peter's. And it's gorgeous and beautiful. But Michelangelo did that statue when he was 22 years old. If you go to Florence, and the Duomo is the cathedral in Florence, across the street is a museum called the Museo, or the Museum of the Duomo. And there is another Pietà. He did it when he was in his middle 80s. I was just blown away by it. because the one in Rome, in the St. Peter's, is very stylized, and we can get a lot out of that. But when you look at the characters and the faces of the one in Duomo, Nicodemus is in it, and that's the image of Michelangelo himself. But at that age, in his 80s, he's feeling a lot, and so you really get a sense of the power of the crucifixion, and especially Mary taking the body down from the cross. If you ever go to Florence, make sure you see that. Of course, David too. David will blow you away. If you've not seen David, David's about 20 feet high, I guess 18 feet high. And I went years ago with my classmate, Father Dave Stoltz, and we got into it, and it was like we must have spent an hour and just sat at the corners. And while we're sitting there, I'm looking at this statue, and I said, seems like he's turning his head and saying, "Hi, Joe." You know, I mean, it's so real. How you can make somebody so real out of a piece of marble. For those of your wives, Michelangelo said, when you start, it's just a block of marble, and you keep chipping away, and you'll finally find the beauty inside. Wives know what I'm talking about. You can explain it to your husbands later. Okay. Again, one of the things that happened during this time is because the Muslims had taken over the Holy Land and all these lands, many of the great kings thought this would be great. We're going to create an army, and we're going to go over the Holy Land and retake the Holy Land for the church. And of course, trying to establish an army, you got to pay some people, and sometimes people don't want to belong to armies, so you pay for a lot of people who just want the money, and sometimes a lot of mercenaries. Look, I'll do anything to get some money to help my families and stuff like this, and you begin to have various crusades that go into the Holy Land. Obviously, the first one recaptured Jerusalem for a while. The second one, Bernard of Clairvaux, I talked about him. The third one, Richard the Lionhearted, out of England, took that. And then the fourth crusade attacked Constantinople. That's Istanbul, which was the capital of the Eastern Empire and the Orthodox Church. Again, this is a bad period for us in the church. The Crusades, while they might have had a worthy idea, in many ways what they did was devastating. As Pope Leo often says, wars don't solve problems sometimes, and certainly they had to do that. It's interesting, after the Fourth Crusade, as you know, the great story of Francis himself decides to go and talk to the leader of the Ottoman Turks, or the Ottoman Empire, and everybody thought Francis is going to get killed because he takes nothing. He just goes simply, and they start talking, and they talk, and they talk, and Francis said, well, can we make sure that we don't destroy everything here, and we want to respect you, and right? And they become friends because they spent time talking with and understanding each other. Francis, again, I think we had a pope named Francis, repeats that over and over again. It's during the 1100s that many of the great cathedrals are starting to be built. Chartres in France. If you ever get to Chartres, go. It's kind of out of the way, but it's a beautiful little French city, and the windows blow your mind away. I've never seen any windows as beautiful as Chartres. My classmate and I, we spent a day there, said, this is worth seeing. And then Notre Dame in Paris. I was in Notre Dame 3 months before the fire, October, whatever, that year before, and we were going over to the church one morning, the group I was taking there, and our guide said, by the way, Father, I got permission for you to say Mass in the cathedral. And I said, what? I said, I heard you have to call a year in advance to do that. She said, I pulled some strings. And so we were in the side chapel where the crown of thorns was, and which was an amazing experience. There were people all over the place, and we're trying to do with a group of about 20 of us have a mass in a side chapel. One quick story, my French is not very good. I can muddle through, is about all I can say. But the sacristans there were just, everybody says the French are not friendly. They couldn't have been more helpful. And I'll never forget when I came back to the sacristy, thank you, that they said, oh, we have a gift for you. I said, what? You have a gift for me? And so he pulls out a lithograph of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and then signs it. Father Joe Graffis said Mass on this day here at the Cathedral, and put the parish seal on it. And it's hanging in my office. And it was like, that was, and of course 3 months later, I get a call from Rabbi Gelia Rooks. I'm so sorry for what's happening at Notre Dame. And I said, South Bend, what's happening at Notre Dame? He said, no, the cathedral is on fire. And I said, oh my God, Anyway, I've heard, I haven't been back, but somebody said, it'll blow your mind, the updated version of Notre Dame and how they did that. One of the great councils was the Lateran Council. John Lateran is one of the 4 basilicas in Rome. It's actually the Cathedral of Rome, not St. Peter's. You want to surprise somebody at a trivia party? What's the Cathedral of Rome? Everybody will say St. Peter's. John Lateran. That was an older church. And it's at that council in 1123 that celibacy became mandatory for all priests. It was not mandatory for the first 1,100 years in the church. You can put that in your notes somewhere. 11th and 12th century, again, the rise of affluence in Europe, corruption of the church in some different ways, especially among the clergy, consolidation of the papacy, hierarchy, religious orders, as I said, and the great universities, Paris and Bologna in Italy, Milan, Geneva. Thomas Aquinas was at the University of Paris. And those great universities, still great universities in many ways today, that were the foundation of so much during that period of time. Key events, we've mentioned some of these already. The rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire began to move out of Israel, Syria, and take over present-day Turkey. And again, that's part of the reason we lost all those great places, Chalcedon, Nicaea. When the Pope went back last year to Nicaea for the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, there's nothing but ruins there, and many of the other places. Turkey today is probably maybe only a couple percentage of Catholics, but at one time it was the center of Christianity. Avignon papacy, I've mentioned already before, the great schisms, anti-popes. One of the things in the 14th century was Black Death, the bubonic plague, probably killed almost a third of Europe. And you can imagine, again, how that affects people in terms of God is punishing us, therefore we're unworthy, and people really don't go to communion at all because maybe once or twice a year. Later the church had to say, you need to go to communion at least once a year. And that even up into our own century, or in the 20th century, early 20th century, people did not go to communion every week as we have done that. But again, you have that gloom and doom around the church that was prevalent in the Middle Ages is seen here as well. Toward the end of the 15th century, 1450s, is the beginning of the printing press, which is kind of like the internet of that particular time, when people could print things easily. And you begin to have press, and you could do pamphlets, and you could do all kind of things, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, out of that is one of the first written versions of printed versions of the Bible was the Gutenberg Bible. and there's not many copies of that in the world. I went to Einsiedel in Switzerland, which is the home abbey for St. Meinrad's, and they have a Gutenberg Bible there. And one of the monks we happened to run into by pure accident, that we ran into the back of church, and we were wondering, saying, anybody here been to St. Meinrad's? And he said, I was there last year. And he said, you want a tour of the monastery? Sure. And he took us everywhere, which was amazing. But he also took to the library, and he said, that's a Gutenberg Bible right over there, And so we're touching a Gutenberg Bible and flipping pages and like, what? Really? Those things are so precious. Most places they're under lock and key. One of the things that also starts at the end of that century is the Spanish Inquisition, beginning to say, well, we've got some people raising some questions, and we need to put them under trial, whether they're a heretic or not. And if they're a heretic, we need to burn them. We need to kill them. And the Spanish Inquisition starts, and there'll be a few other during that period of time. Okay, so you finished that era. There's a lot to cover in that era, but any quick questions about this era before we go into the next one? Yes, ma'am. Well, you got a microphone person here. Harrison will be your official microphone person.
Why did they institute celibacy? Was it for economic reasons?
Yes. Basically, again, when a person became a pastor, the land of the church and all that was his. And therefore he could make some money off of that. Lots of abuses come on that. And especially when you have a family and children, inheritance and all that kind of stuff, monies get, and it's saying, well, this is not going to help the church at all. And besides, since the religious orders have been doing this for years, they're much holier than diocesan priests are. So that's kind of celibacy came into the church because of that, and made it a lot cheaper for all of you, in many different ways even today. So I was talking with Father Jim Flynn, and he was saying when he was ordained, the salary per month was $45 a month for priests. And I said, well, when I was ordained, it was $120 a month. So we had 3 priests there, and it was $500 a month for 3 priests. Now we had a rectory, of course, and food and all that kind of stuff, but it was a different world than it is today, for sure.
Joe?
Yes.
The easier answer is
Oh, yes.
Bastards can't inherit.
Well,
Kings and bishops can screw around all they want, and nobody ever is going to inherit the cathedral or the castle.
Right. Bob is pretty direct about those kind of things. That's true. Thanks, Bob. Good point. Yes. None? Get your microphone there so everybody can hear you.
Where in all this is Martin Luther and the reforms?
We're not there yet.
We're not there. Okay, thanks.
We're about to get there.
Okay.
That's the next one. Thank you. Oh, Harrison, right over here. Thank you.
Where does Jansenism fit in this?
Oh, well, there's a lot of heresies that we can go through. Jansenism is one of them, Manichaeism and things like that. But Jansenism is one of those heresies. To some extent, I don't want to blame Augustine, but, when we start talking about the body is bad and the soul is good, and anything that has anything to do with sex is bad, and Jansenists were like very much about that it's all about the soul, and anything that's corporal is bad. So again, and that's another route for celibacy, that, anything like that, we want you to be holy, and you don't want you to be corrupted by those other people. And that Jansenism has repeated itself over and over, even in our own day, in lots of ways.
Weren't they responsible for that schism between the people?
What?
Weren't the Jansenists responsible for that whole genre where you couldn't receive communion but
Right.
once a year, and you had to? It was,
Well, it's even before that, but that was one of the reasons, for sure. And I remember I'm Sulpician trained. The Sulpician Fathers, which is a society, not a religious order, taught us at St. Thomas Seminary 6 years here and St. Mary's in Baltimore 6 years. So, but at their root, they were very Jansenistic when they started. They're not anymore, but it was always interesting. That was kind of one of those things where, like, wait a minute, some of the older Sulpicians that taught us were like, I think they're a little Jansenistic, but that many of our heresies keep repeating and repeating and repeating. Okay. All right, let's go on to Martin Luther. The age of, after the Reformation, one of the things I didn't say last week, confession and the sacrament of penance. Early on in the church, and remember I said Constantine waited till he near death before to get baptized, because baptism forgave your sins. But what happens if you sin after that? We didn't really have a mechanism. And then when Patrick took over Ireland, some of the Irish priests began to say, well, maybe people could come to us and confess their sins individually, and then we would give them a penance and go and do your penance. And when you've finished your penance, come back and get absolution. And that was the beginnings of what we call now the sacrament of reconciliation. And it's interesting that in order to help the priest, they invented a book called the Penitentiales, which was kind of like a book that says, okay, on this side, here's a list of sins. Okay. The appropriate penance would be this. There's something. I've seen those books. I can't read them, but it was like I would always be curious. How did they know about all these sins and list all these sins? And then what's the appropriate penance? And sometimes you get tempted in the confessions. And I wonder what would be the appropriate penance for this person. Anyway.
Is that the time when they started rent a monk to do your penance?
Well, I mean,
heard about that.
A lot of times monks went around and did reconciliation, but there was always a time period of difference. Because before the Irish monks did that, sometimes how many times could you go through the penance? And somebody said, well, maybe you could go through it once, twice, 3 times, rather than as often as we think about it today. But the formation of the sacrament of penance says we know it from our growing up days, goes back to Trent, which is very late compared to things. And then, of course, since then. Do what now? Yeah, let's take, why don't we take a break here and 8 o'clock. So how about, can we do a 10-minute break? Everybody go into the Protestant Reformation. And then we'll go into another section right after that, which is the Age of Enlightenment, stuff like that. I think we can get there, but we'll try to get as far as we can. But I know this is a particularly important period for all of us. As we look at the Age of Reformation, both Protestant and Catholic Reformation. We often talk about the Catholic one being the Counter-Reformation. During these next about 150 years. You've seen all the questions of why there was bubbling going on, not only politically, but economically, as well as religiously. And during this period of time as well, with that old feudal system, the peasant class is beginning to revolt. because they feel like they're being put down, they're oppressed, which they were, and begin to rebel. So there's a lot of popular movements going on during this time. That begins much of the conflicts, both religiously as well as socially and within the society. And of course, whenever there's conflicts like that, the powers that be get very defensive immediately. Like, we've got to hold things down. Got to hold things down. Is one shape or form. We all do that. That's part of human nature. But sometimes we get overly defensive. You ever done that? Again, I mentioned the printing press begins this knowledge. When somebody has an idea, they can put together a printing press, a pamphlet, and start passing it out and raising questions. We call it social media today, and anybody can publish anything, whether it's true or it's not true, are a fantasy of some people, and it's hard to begin to realize what's true and what's not true. But it's also because of that printing press, where people were not well educated for a lot of different reasons, didn't know what was going on in universities and all that kind of stuff. Suddenly, the popular versions of that, and there becomes a knowledge explosion. I saw this graphically done a couple years ago. I forgot who did it or something like that. That you could say if the knowledge of the world between roughly 0 and 1500 was 1, it began to double from 1500 on almost every 25 or 50 years. Until now, it's just kind of like it quadruples or every year, again, with internet and all the stuff that we have today, which really makes it hard in lots of ways. But that kind of thing was happening at this time, a knowledge explosion. And again, I mentioned the buying and selling of indulgences. Perhaps it had at its base a good reason, but when you start selling things, spiritual things for money, and making a lot of money off of it, problems start. We still have stipends today, although we've tried to get rid of most of stipends, but in our diocese, a stipend for a daily mass is $10. We haven't. It was $3, I think, when I was ordained. So inflation-wise, it should be up, but hey, most of us we're not going to deal with that. We don't need to do that. Again, centralized authority in Rome. And as I mentioned, that Inquisition, starting in Spain, people saying, okay, so if somebody's saying something, we need to put them in front of a court, and if we don't like what they're saying, then we should execute them by burning at the stake or whatever. Toward the end of by 1570 is the Council of Trent, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I think this is going to work now. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So some of the strengths that come out of this is there is a counter-Reformation movement. And the Council of Trent did a lot of good things. It started a seminary system so that priests were more educated and had some basic backgrounds of history and theology and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it was and scholasticism and all those kind of things that we had for the next 400 years. And the seminary systems didn't change much from the 16th century until the middle of the 20th century. I grew up in a seminary system. My first 6-7 years was the military school, and the rule was very strict. And what you could do and what you couldn't do, what you could or shouldn't do during the summer, we won't go into all that kind of stuff. That would really bore you, but we laugh about it now in many different ways. But it began a lot of that reform of the clergy and the seminaries. And of course, this is also one of the new religious orders that comes out of the Reformation, is Ignatius Loyola begins to establish the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, which he Ignatius, as you know, some of his story was a Spaniard, became a soldier, got injured severely in his late 20s, and couldn't continue being a soldier, but had a military background, and decided to say, we need something like that, a military theological group that's that supports the Pope and the Church. And of course, he starts the Society of Jesus. Most Jesuits have to have at least one, if not two, doctorates before they're ordained in whatever fields and all that kind of stuff. So they become some of the most highly educated people in the church and start many universities, as we've got a lot in the United States that are from the Society of Jesuits. And they take 4 vows, obviously poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their 4th vow, don't laugh, loyalty to the Pope. and a lot of people said, when have the Jesuits ever been loyal to the Pope? in some ways, because they've also challenged a lot of popes. And of course, we had our first Jesuit Pope in Francis. But Ignatius did a lot of his spiritual exercises are amazing. And this, as you heard a lot of this from Francis, Pope Francis, discernment. You know, discern your decisions. Think through them. Pray about your decisions. Don't just make instantaneous decisions. Think your way through. And of course, that's part of what he tried to bring to the church as a Jesuit in his papacy, as well as bringing back that notion of synodality, a listening church. Obviously, part of this, the style, I guess, of this time, because you've got more educated people, and people are wanting education, that you start to get a kind of a teacher-student mechanism, where it's more lecture style and less dialogue. I will tell you what you need to believe. This is the way you need to believe. Well, I don't understand that. This is the way you need to believe. We've figured it all out, and now we will pass it on to you. And we begin to have things like catechisms. We've had catechisms before, but writing things down, this is Catholic belief. What it says in the catechism, that's it. No ands, ifs, or buts. And some of us remember the Baltimore Catechism, and there are a couple of people in the room. I still have my Baltimore Catechism from the 4th grade. I've always kept it. It's always interesting to look back at it sometimes, but helpful at a point, but sometimes overused. But, you know, how do we balance, you know, spreading the faith, telling us this is what we believe, but if somebody challenges that, how do we deal with that? We've always had that challenge. Obviously, during this time, there's a whole reevaluation during the Council of the Liturgy, and things had kind of gotten into chaos. So at Trent, at the end of it, at 1570, we form what we now today call the Tridentine Latin Mass. Anybody in the room remember that? Anybody with gray hair, I'm sure, remembers that for sure. Huh? Or no hair, that's for sure. And it, I remember it well. Quick side story, since Ozzy's funeral was today. Father Oz, this is last year sometime, he was on a Zoom meeting that I had with some priests, and if you knew Ozzy, was very gentle, very patient, an amazing guy in lots of ways, but, you know, he never outburst. Well, all of a sudden, in the middle of this Zoom meeting, Ozzy says, I need to rant. And of course, all of us like, Ozzy, rant, you know? And all of a sudden, he went off. He said, I don't understand some of these young guys want to go back to the Latin Mass. He said, I was ordained in 1954. I said Latin Masses for well over 10 years. I have no desire to go back to the Latin Mass. It didn't make any sense, and he said in the 1950s they think were the ideal church. It wasn't the ideal church in the 50s. And so he goes on and on and on. And we're all just laughing because this is out of character for him. And he said, are you laughing at me? I said, no, Ozzy. We're just saying this is a different Ozzy than we sometimes see. But I said, gosh, it'd be great if the next assembly we have, if you'd get up and say that maybe in a nicer way. But if you would say the same thing. And he never got to do that, unfortunately. But I'm not sure they would have listened to him anyway. But the liturgy gets frozen in one way, which is a European way with the Latin Mass that many of us grew up in. It wasn't until the council that changed, and some people still are upset about all that. And of course, I mentioned threats and attacks cause great defensiveness in the church and society in many ways. So we have Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a scripture scholar, but a very, very scrupulous man, but saw a lot of the abuses that were going on in the church and was very incensed by it. And therefore, he began to raise questions. And of course, the classic was in 1517 that he went to the doors of the Wittenberg Church and tacked 93 theses on the church of questions that need to be raised. And all hell broke loose with that. And of course, we didn't handle that very well because the church got defensive. They sent Tetzel, a Dominican, to argue with him. And so there were great meetings in the center of cities where Luther in Germany and Tetzel would argue with each other publicly, and people were watching, like a wrestling match or something like that. They had no idea what they were talking about. But it was clashing defensive,ness. And eventually he gets excommunicated and starts the Lutheran Church. Now, part of the Lutheran tradition is very Catholic in lots of ways. So that if you have ever gone to a Lutheran service, you'd say, well, there's a few little differences, but, it's basically the same as us. And of course, eventually, John Calvin will come along and say, well, that's too Catholic. We need to be more congregational and less structural. And starts the Presbyterian Church. And then, of course, in Scotland. And then we have Henry VIII, of course, wanted to divorce his wife and couldn't get an annulment, so he started his own church, the Episcopal Church, or the Anglican Church. And so if you look at the back of what I just gave to you, I know I got a copy of it here. What did I do with that? Let me. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, right here. Okay. I have this diagram on the back that was done a couple of years ago that I think might be kind of helpful to look at it. I guess you probably have to turn it to the side a little bit. But obviously, you look at the Roman Catholic Church there in the middle, and then the Orthodox Church. And one of the first splits, of course, came early on, but 1054 was when the Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic Church split. Now, they split basically not over theology, but respect for differences. Because you can see all the various Orthodox churches from Turkey and Syria and Egypt and various things, they all enculturated the liturgy for their culture. And so they had different rites, and they still have different rites today. But the Western Church in Rome said we've got to be uniform. and therefore there's tension. There's not a respect for differences. So to some extent, that goes back to the 11th century. There are some Eastern Catholic churches that are in union with Rome, and they have a lot of characteristics of the Orthodox Church, but they are in union with Rome. Sometimes when you see conclaves, you see some of the cardinals wear a different robe, and they're, instead of a mitre that looks like a crown of some sort, that's part of the Eastern Church and stuff like that. For the most part, theologically, we agree on almost everything theologically. The Orthodox tradition, and to some extent the Eastern Catholic rites, emphasize Easter over Good Friday. We have tended in the West to emphasize Good Friday over Easter. Typical example of that is the cross. Most of our churches have a Good Friday cross in it. Most Orthodox churches will have a Easter Sunday, Jesus is risen cross. Well, it's both and. It's not, as Pope Benedict XVI often said, it isn't either or, it's both and. How do we balance both? I can't remember what church, somewhere I was, not in this diocese, but in their church, they have big cross. Half the year it's Good Friday cross. When it comes to Easter season, they turn it around and it's the Easter Sunday cross. I thought it's an interesting way to do that, is try to balance both. But that was a major division, mostly cultural, not theological. Then, of course, you have the split with the Lutherans, but they're still very close to Roman Catholics. And then, of course, you've got Presbyterians and the Reformed churches began to split off of Lutherans, and even more congregational churches with very little structure in terms of any kind of hierarchy, and the United Church of Christ and churches like that in various centuries. I can't go into all those kind of details. Obviously, another route beside the Reformed and Lutheran is the Anglican tradition. And of course, within the Anglican tradition, many times the Methodists were a lower church. The Anglicans were too high church, too much ceremony and vestments and all that kind of stuff. We want to be more congregational and simpler. You see these tensions back and forth. We need to get back to the first century when everything was simple. And so you begin to see African Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church, even a split off of them in more Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches like the Pentecostals and holiness churches. Archbishop Shelton often says, he was the bishop of Houma Thibodeau before he came here. And I was talking with him one day, and he said, Joe, in my diocese down there, we had very little ecumenism because we either had Catholics, which 60% of the diocese was Catholic, the rest were Pentecostals, and they don't want to be ecumenical at all. So there was no, and he said, I'm still trying to adjust to all these Anglicans and Lutherans and all that kind of stuff because that's not in my experience from Louisiana. And I said, well, we can teach you a lot if you want to. And then, of course, later on, there's another split, what we call the Anabaptist movement. Not exactly Baptist as we think of it, but more kind of like the Mennonites and the Amish, who were utterly simple. They probably take after Francis a little bit, but they probably didn't know who Francis was, and that tradition as well. But as we, and then there is some other splits from the Oriental churches that you see there that go back to the 4th centuries. But I think you can see how the splits are. If you go to a Lutheran service or an Anglican service, you think you're Catholic, and we're very close in lots of ways. And some of our theology, which split us in the past, has no longer been. Even sometimes our understanding, because since the Second Vatican Council, there's been an enormous amount of dialogue that's gone on. And, where we thought we're real presence people, Jesus is really present in the Eucharist, and they're just symbolic presence over here. We realize, are we that far apart? We have symbols of bread and wine, but what is Christ present? However you want to define that, maybe not through the word transubstantiation, which is a scholastic term, but, there's a lot of I work with a lot of disciples of Christ ministers, and they're very much understand that, Christ is present. We wouldn't define it the way you do it, but we believe Christ is present. And, of course, they let anybody go to communion, and they can't quite understand, well, why can't we go to communion in the Catholic Church? There's a lot of questions about that, which we can't go into tonight. But hopefully you kind of see, I think that little diagram I really found helpful a couple of years ago to kind of understand how we split and how maybe we can get back together someday. But it's obviously, Zwingli was another one of those reformers. I mentioned Henry VIII, and of course the great story of Thomas More, the good Catholic and the chancellor of the diocese. And then he he tries to be silent when Henry splits the church off, but eventually Henry wants him to pledge allegiance to Henry, and I can't do that. So he gets beheaded for doing that, as Bishop John Fisher, those two great English saints. But it's really interesting, the new Archbishop of Canterbury is a woman bishop, and Pope Leo sent a message to her when she was installed, come see me, we need to talk, and things like that. That would never have happened 50 years ago. Of course, we wouldn't have had a woman bishop either 50 years ago, stuff like that. But it's just kind of interesting. Unfortunately, that's a very, very divisive thing within the Anglican community, because in Africa and some of the parts even of Central America, with the understanding of women and men, they're not ready for that. So, that's part of our problem as well. We said, well, Europe and the United States might be ready, but there are other parts of the church that could split us off. It's not easy to get us all together, and we make it too easy sometimes. John Calvin was from Geneva in Switzerland, an amazing reformer in lots of ways that's been very influential. I mentioned Loyola already. One of the great women saints of this time was Teresa of Avila, a mystic and one of the doctors of the church, official teacher of the church, as Catherine of Siena is, and Hildegard of Bingen. I was there for her canonization several years ago, and I was really great to be there for her. She's a very kind of unknown saint, but her writings are amazing sometimes. And Teresa, along with John of the Cross, obviously was a Carmelite in the Carmelite orders. DeSales High School was founded by the Carmelites here in town. Again, one of the great giants of theologians of this particular era. A couple of other people on the Counter-Reformation was Charles Borromeo as a reformer. His uncle was the bishop of Rome, the Pope, and so he made him a cardinal when he was like 22. Hadn't been ordained yet, but eventually got ordained. He was cardinal before he was ordained. Hello, and then eventually was ordained, and then a few years later he made him the bishop of Milan, huge city, and he became a great reformer in a very pastoral way. Although you might not always, he's the person that invented confessionals. You might explain that to some of the younger people, what a confessional is, the priest sits in the middle and there's people come from either side and there's a sliding, there's still one at St. Boniface. I say masses at St. Boniface and I always try to hear confessions between the masses. And it's like, I haven't been in a confessional like this in 50 years. But a blast from the past. I said, I got to make sure I close that one, open this. That's another whole story. But he was a great giant of a reformer in a very positive way. And we used to have a parish downtown, St. Charles Borromeo, where I was a deacon thousands of years ago. But now it's in very disrepair. It's sad. Rose of Lima in the 17th century was one of the first saints of the Americas, and obviously a favorite saint of a lot of people out of Peru. So our present Pope, who spent 20 years in Peru, would have a great allegiance to her, and of course Mary from his experience in the Americas as well. Later on, it's always interesting to hear the story of Robert Bellarmine, Bellarmine University. I was campus minister there before I came to Epiphany for 7 years. Had a great time there with a lot of students that are still friends. Robert Bellarmine was one of the great theologians of this era and tried to push the envelope in many different ways, but always kept getting feedback, well, you can't go across these boundaries and stuff like that. One quick aside, I forgot to mention about Thomas Aquinas. We talked about how great he was. He was almost condemned and excommunicated because of his writings. The only reason it didn't happen, the Pope had the document on his desk and the Pope died. So he never got excommunicated. But becomes a saint in the next century. So again, Bellarmine's a little bit like that in one sense, that he was trying to say, okay, can we find some middle ground sometimes? And one of his great friends was Galileo. And of course, Galileo was doing all this study, the stars and all that kind of stuff. Saying, the world's not flat, the world's round, and the sun and the moon, we rotate around that and all that. And these ideas were blowing people's minds because it wasn't the concept that most people had at the time. And Galileo says, I'm going to publish this. And Bellarmine says, friend, you need to be quiet about this. If you do that, you're going to get in big doo-doo. So don't do it. And he kept pushing him off. Eventually, Galileo says, I'm going to go ahead and publish. And of course, Bellarmine was right. All of a sudden, they condemned and excommunicated Galileo. And of course, who did they ask to write the letter or the decree of excommunication? Robert Bellarmine, which he hated to do and stuff like that. But it's just an interesting time. And of course, it was John Paul II that officially lifted the excommunication of Galileo. Only, what is it, 400 years later, but, hey, we're a little slow sometimes, something like that. But it's an interesting story with them. Francis de Sales High School again, a great educator, certainly in the 17th century in lots of ways. Other events that are happening around all of this, of course, is 1492. There was some Italian kind of found some islands in the Caribbean and all that kind of stuff, and so-called discovered the Americas, although they had been discovered by other people long before, and there were indigenous peoples here already. But again, as I said, the revolt of the peasant class, and you begin to get a little bit of a sense in this period of time of a middle class. Not great, but middle class rather than all the elites and the rich are here and all the poor peasants are down here. You begin to see that. Knowledge explosion I mentioned, printing press, Luther, 93 Theses. The Council of Trent sometimes gets a bad name. There's a interesting author, if you're ever familiar with councils, is John O'Malley, just died a couple years ago. He has What Happened at Vatican II, incredible book about Vatican II, if you ever want to know about. But he also has a book on Vatican I that's very, very interesting. And he has a book on the Council of Trent. And he writes in a very good way that's relatively easy if you know a little bit of the history about some of these things. But the Council of Trent did a lot of good things that sometimes we're just not aware of. It lasted off and on for almost 20 years. So they come off, they go back home, come off, come back home, and all that kind of stuff. And I've mentioned with Pius V started the Tridentine Latin Mass as promulgated in 1570. And from 1570 to 1970, that was the liturgy for the Western Church, the Latin Rite Church that most of us grew up in. The Inquisition I've mentioned already. Okay. Oh, okay. I'm going to try to go quickly through this next part there because I want to leave some time for a few questions. The next era, in the middle of the 1700s to roughly, let's say, 1800, because we won't get through all of this tonight, was the rise of science. Again, Galileo and Copernicus and all these kind of scientists are raising a lot of scientific questions that kind of go against the traditional history of the church, and therefore some of the things we just took for granted as, well, that's true. Science says that isn't exactly true. We still have that problem today. We're still not always picking up on science. I don't want to get off into the issue, but the last major document that the church really wrote about homosexuality was 1980. 46 years ago? I mean, we know a hell of a lot more scientifically about homosexuality today than we did then. We need to write another document because what we said back then does not fit at all where we are. Pope Francis knew that, but how many issues can he deal with at one time? Talking about getting it. So the rise of science and lots of new discoveries during this period of time. It's also the rise of some of the great philosophers, John Locke, rationalism and the Enlightenment. And of course, again, that raises questions with the church when we've assumed, well, scholasticism and Aristotle and Plato are the only people we really need to pay attention to. They begin to raise lots of other questions. And again, that makes the church defensive against all the people and pushing back on this. It's also an age in the society where you've got a lot of absolute monarchies. The French king, the monarchs, the absolute kings, an absolute authority versus what's happening with political revolution. So sometimes the popes begin to see these absolute monarchs and say, well, maybe that's what we should be sometimes. And you begin to see that consolidation, even more centralization in the papacy and Rome and the Holy See. But there are some good popes, strong popes. There's a whole missionary expansion that goes on throughout the world. And obviously beginning to missionaries in the Americas, Latin America, Central America, to some extent even our own, but obviously parts of Africa, Southern Africa, and certainly in India, and then the Far East. You begin to see missionaries going everywhere. And it's also, during this time, the rise of a lot of religious orders. Obviously, St. Vincent de Paul is one of the great giants of this era, who starts what the Sisters of Charity, obviously in France, and of course the Sisters of Charity, both Nazareth here in Kentucky, but Sisters of Charity of Emmitsburg, Maryland, after Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton, and all those. And they in turn, like the religious men, become the counterculture in the church in lots of ways, raising lots of questions. They don't get listened to very much, but they're raising the right questions, but they become the educators and the nurses, meeting the needs of people at the local level in so many different ways that are often taken for granted. Church becomes much more at this time, beginning in these centuries, to become more worldwide, not just European. And with only European cultures, and particularly the Church of the West, which is the Roman Catholic Church. Enlightenment, of course, raises questions about democracy and democratic principles. And maybe that will help rise up those who are in middle class and those who are poor. But the church doesn't like that democratic stuff. And so democracies are condemned, even in the 19th century, which we'll get to. But new worlds are being discovered, and many other cultures that we didn't even know about were happening. Some of the weaknesses, going back to your question about Jansenism, anti-sexuality, particularly in France. Again, that keeps popping up from time to time. The body is bad, only the soul is good. We get into some pious prayers and pious theology that is really not healthy in many different ways. Secularism, is the study of the world in the sense of we're part of the world, and we don't really need religion, but we can deal with everything on our own. And part of it is if we don't see it empirically, well, we don't have to believe it. If it's something nebulous or pie in the sky, we don't have to be, particularly in Europe. We so begin to see that, and of course that's been a growing philosophy and throughout the next couple of centuries. To some extent, that creates both the Enlightenment, anti-religious thinking, and anti-institutional attitudes. We have that again today. That's those same kind of things, especially in the last 25 years. I mentioned a couple of people, Vincent de Paul, the father of charity. In South America, the two great saints that dealt with the slaves, Martin de Porres, who was African, and Peter Claver, who was not, but did an enormous amount of conversion of many of the slaves in Latin America. Junipero Serra in our own country started the California Missions, did some really good work, but also some bad work in terms of not respecting the indigenous people, indigenous religions, and while he's a canonized saint, some people raise questions about that sometimes. I've mentioned John Locke, who is the father of rationalism. Reason is the only thing, and obviously if you only think from reason, then faith has no place. Well, our tradition has always been it's faith and reason. We need to reason to things. We need to find reasonable answers to things. But there are things that are still mysteries. The American Revolution, I've heard we're going to celebrate that this year, but I don't know about that. And the French Revolution, lots of migration comes to the United States over that, and we'll get to Napoleon next week. Okay. I'm going to wrap up here very quickly. There again, key elements out of this where the Far East becomes where a lot of missionaries are. Francis Xavier, of course, was there. Missionary expansion, scientific exploration, enlightenment, absolute monarchies, political revolution, start, religious orders, heresies I mentioned, and we'll get to the syllabus of error next one. So I've covered that really quickly, but we've got 7 minutes to go, and you've been patient. So I wish we could do a little bit of group work, but maybe if I take some questions that this raised for you, maybe that's good. And where is our Harrison is our mic man. Uh-oh.
First of all, I love the diagram. And so it's got me thinking about all of the little pop-up churches that I have seen everywhere with all kinds of names, like Church of the Shadow of Christ and Church of the, all these. And so to me, it seems like all of these little so-called non-denominational churches, they're everywhere. Wouldn't that dilute all of these?
Yes.
And it seems to me
Well,
that it would
I
make the
think
Catholic Church stronger.
Institutional churches, which like the Catholic Church, and a hierarchy and a structure, and the Anglicans and the Lutherans have that. Presbyterians to a slightly lesser degree, as long as it's a good and decent order. That's what Presbyterians say. As long as it's done in good and decent order. That's a joke, but you could, which they tell, not me. Anyway, but I think you've always got that. People, we got to get back to the gospel and how it was in the first century, and we can start our own little church, and we can read this. And of course, unfortunately, when you get a small group like that, it's only your opinions and your little group and your little group thinking. And suddenly things in the gospel like, well, we got people that don't speak English that come to our country. They can't be good. Well, let's get rid of them. They need to learn English right now, or whatever it might be. Or, they came from Africa. Well, and all that. So I think there's in American culture particularly, because we're so freedom oriented, that we don't like anybody telling us what to do. So we like to be independent and free and come up with our own church, our own plan, who we're going to let in and who we're not going to let in. And so what splits happen all the time in all of us. And, we're lucky. I mean, the Second Vatican Council, which we'll talk about, everybody thought there was going to be a schism over that council. And Paul VI did a marvelous job of holding the church together during that time, because it's so easy to split. And so many churches, I mean, I'd hate to see Anglicans trying to split over, women priests and bishops and saying, well, we're going to become a separate denomination. How do we respect differences and yet be unified is a real challenge for all of us. And, institutions have a place. But, how do you balance pastoral versus, and Francis, of course, blew people's minds because he said, who am I to judge? Meet people where they are, and don't just say, condemn them. How do we try to say, how can we bring them along and help them talk about maybe they've got something we can learn from, and maybe we've got something that they can learn from, and that kind of thing. But it's true. Sheila?
I know that it is important to mention about rationalism and enlightenment and everything, but I just don't believe that for the majority of people in the church, that impacted their life. I mean, and a lot is left out here about, immigration and, like the simple Catholic way of life. My parents came from Ireland, and for generations before, it just doesn't seem like we always, when we talk about church history, we kind of get to that about the rationalism and enlightenment.
I
but
think
African Americans didn't, they weren't really impacted by that, or but still, like, the church is growing, and I'm just trying to.
Well,
I'm just giving a
I think,
picture.
we reason to things, and sometimes we reason to things that, in our minds, when we reason to say, well, only whites are important. Christian nationalism we've got right now, and that's not really reasonable, but some people think it's reasonable. And I think, and some people say, the root of rationalism is that, if you can't see it, don't have to believe it. Well, we say there's something beyond that, so it's something that I think affects all of us at various levels. Maybe not consciously, but I think and I think for a lot of young people, so often, they stop their religious education maybe at the end of the 8th grade or early high school or something like that. And they've gotten answers that, are more childish because you can't deal with kids that way. And all of a sudden they start thinking things, and it says, those answers don't fit, so they must not be true. Rather than realize you've got a whole history of theology and things like that give you some answers, and maybe you're going to be, now your mind can grasp that. And of course, our theological background is very much about reason and all that kind of stuff. So I think it affects us, maybe not directly, but very much indirectly. Okay.
Yeah,
Couple
I've got
more
a rather-
questions.
Yeah, a rather simple question in regards to the Orthodox Church.
The what
Yeah,
now?
The Orthodox
Church. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the schism that occurred. And as I recall, the schism occurred because of the recognition of the Pope. But
Well, not just that.
Well,
they don't recognize the Pope, but it was more about cultural differences is why they said they separated and did
Okay.
not. But
okay, so my question is this: with the absence of that belief, or even some of those cultural beliefs, how is the Orthodox Church administratively set up
okay.
in order to address
They,
that?
they set up their churches with various patriarchs. We have patriarchs in the Catholic Church as well, but Bartholomew, the patriarch of Constantinople, which is kind of the center of Orthodox religion, is kind of they wouldn't call it this way. He's not the Pope, but one of the primary patriarchs. And of course, for the last 40 years, or almost 50 years now, there's been a lot of dialogue, and almost every time any major event happens in Rome, the Pope always invites him to come and participate. I was something in Rome, I can't remember what it was for, right? But it was very interesting to see. There was an outdoor service, and Pope Benedict was sitting there on the same platform in an equal chair was Bartholomew. And I said, wow, what a visual that is. Saying, co-equal, because we're doing a Christian service together, stuff like that. There's a lot. My professor, Raymond Brown, thought back in the 60s when he was teaching us that before the end of the 20th century, Orthodox and Catholics would come back together. Never happened, of course, but lots of challenges to that. But there's a lot of hope for that. And I think we've made a lot of bridges with our Muslim brothers and sisters. It's great to see Leo go to a mosque, and pray in the mosque and talk about in countries that are mostly Muslim, he's been in Iraq, and Francis was in Iraq and stuff like that. So, there are lots of good signs. We're just going to have to go slow because people change slowly. Maybe one last.
I have a question.
I'm sorry.
Going back
Nice
to
question, though.
the Baltimore Catechism. So my memory is that growing up, we definitely had a lot of Baltimore Catechism and a lot of prayers. My father actually had canon law books at home, so we were privy to even that
Bob.
stuff. But reading the Bible so that we memorized it or whatever never seemed to be part of our growing up. And many Catholics that I know,
Right.
cradle Catholics, that isn't part of their experience. So maybe I'm jumping the gun into next week's
Right.
thing, but that seems to me to be a difference in terms of even, the Protestant
Right.
churches seem much
Let me
better.
answer that, and we
Okay.
will go into that more
Okay.
next week. My quick story is my father was Methodist, became Catholic at the very end of his life because he went to Catholic church all the time, knew more priests than my mother ever did. But my dad read his Bible every day. And it's probably affected me. I always said my dad, because he read the Bible. And I was always trying to get my mother to read it. She was scared to death, partly because little or no training. And again, we didn't have a lot of things about how do we interpret the Bible. And a lot of that's come after the Second Vatican Council. Not enough, I think, for later generations. But one of my stories that's dear to me, and Father Jim would know this. My dad went to the pastor at Lourdes, Tony Gerst, and Jim was there at that time, and said, I want to start a Bible study, but I'm not Catholic. And he said, so give me whatever I need to do. I just want him to read the Bible and talk about it. And they started a Bible study. He started at Lourdes in 1958. And of course, when the council came around, he was getting all excited about, people are going to read the Bible and all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, he died of cancer in 1964. But, and one of the things Tony Gerst told him was, Jerry, we can have lectors now. I want you to be one of the first lectors. And he never got to do it. But he said, it's okay. I could have, and all that kind of stuff. But I think, that we still suffer from that. But the interpretation of the Bible, and Lord knows right now with this whole Christian nationalism and some of that stuff is such a misinterpretation of the scriptures because it's written in Near Eastern thought, and we can't just think of European Western thought and apply that to the Bible. We've got to look at the symbols because the Bible is so much symbolic. It's metaphor of human experience. And when you want to get literal and all that, well, it talks about homosexuality here. Well, what were they really talking about? Not exactly what we're talking about today, but it's a good question. We'll get some of that next week. Anyway, we've kind of done. Thank you for hanging in there tonight. Next week we'll start with 1800 Napoleon roughly. And we got 225 years next week, so should be quick. No, we got a lot to cover over that period of time.